1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay, so just on Richard Burton, so you said he managed to get the whole recording done in one day, so I'm guessing that he was flawless, no mistakes, no line flubs or anything like that.
Not true. I can't think of anybody that doesn't make flubs or get stuck on words. I always remember one of the characters, a very minor character in the original double album, was an astronomer named Ogilvy, and he couldn't say Ogilvy. I can still hardly say it. It was just the way the word is pronounced, and he said, maybe because of his Welshness, it was a tongue twister in some way, and we have umpteen tapes of him taking it, and it wasn't quite right. He eventually got it, and he got it perfectly. He he had a trouble with Billericay, which was a town that you pass through in the story. And we have it on tape still to this day. It's Billericay. How do you say it? Oh, I'm a Yank. What do you want? And Richard kept saying everything but Billericay. So I think that was the word that took us ages.
And at Billericay, everything had shriveled and died.
The suggestion is that it's Billericay.
Billericay.
From Brooklyn, Richard, I know nothing.
Billericay, okay. And at Billericay, everything had shriveled and died.
Billericay.
Fortunately, we all found the funny side of it. Here's one of the great actors of the day with a voice, that you could die for, and he still had the odd word or two that he was stumbling on.
I think my favorite one of the outtakes that I've heard was he's reading through one of the lines, and then he sort of stops and you hear him sort of breathe in, and then he goes, "Oh, that was the coffee there, boys, I think." And it's just sort of breaks this, obviously, and it's still got the reverb on. It still sounds very grand, and he just sort of breaks it, and you realize, he's just a human being like anyone else.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's in a way what I meant. But there's nobody that's perfect.
I scrambled up to the crest of Primrose Hill, and the Martians' camp was below me. A mighty space it was, and scattered about it in their overturned machines. Sorry, boys, coffee's no good to me.
We have quite a lot of outtakes from all the cast.
Take 3.
Is this your house?
Sorry, I just thought, what a load of nutcases. Said, is this your house? Halt! No, say halt. Oh, halt! Okay, sorry.
It must be really nice to have all these outtakes to sort of go back and listen to and reminisce about the recording of it all.
Yeah, I'm sure any actor or performer will look back at those sort of things at least as equal to the finished work that they did, because I can go to these outtakes at any time, which every once in a while, maybe with my family and we fancy having a good laugh, we go back to them, and it brings back all the things that it took to get to a finished master.
I remember listening to Michael Sheen on a podcast interview, and when you guys came to do the audiobook, which I will talk to you about later on, he said that one of the greatest moments of his life was where he sat down with you and you played him all those outtakes, because that album meant so much to him growing up. And I just thought, it's fascinating to think that, something like that, even for someone like Michael Sheen, who's, another great Welsh actor, this album really does, resonate with people like that.
I only found out that he even knew the War of the Worlds when he was doing an interview for, I think it was a magazine in California, and if it wasn't California, it was like New York. It was a national magazine, and it was one of those types of interviews where he was being asked questions like, what's your favorite food? What's your favorite
right.
this, that, and the other. And one was, what's your favorite album of all time? Do you have one? He said, oh, yes. And it said Jeff Wayne's The War of the Worlds. And somebody sent it to me from America. Right. And I opened and read it. Oh, my goodness. The audiobook hadn't yet even been discussed. I didn't know we were going to be doing that project at that point in time. And then he came back to England, and he was on, I think it was Desert Island Discs, and the same sort of question came up. And he named the recording, and then he had the ability to interview somebody on the program, and he asked if I'd like to come on and be interviewed by him. Right. And that was then getting close to, by that point, where the audiobook was going to happen. And we approached Michael, and he just said, it was the same. Working with Richard came about as a flash of just dumb luck. And that was the same when we did a New Generation album of The War of the Worlds in 2012. And Liam Neeson took over the role of the journalist. And I discovered when I met him for the first time in New York that he had bought the album when it first came out all those years ago. Right. So there's the luck of again, where somebody of such great stature was almost pre-sold when we approached him. And now here's Michael. I didn't know how much luckier I could get. It's just something, I don't even know that whether it's with Welsh people. That I also did a project, another musical work based around a true story, where again it needed it was the role of a Roman senator named Marcus Crassus, who was the politician, the senator, who was credited with defeating Spartacus after some 2 years, where every army that was sent against Spartacus were defeated. And that turned out to be Anthony Hopkins. So between Richard, Michael, and Anthony, all from either Port Talbot or thereabouts, and then just cherry on the cake, I worked for about 6 years, again here in my studio with Catherine Zeta-Jones, right, who's from Swansea. And my engineer on the double album of The War of the Worlds was also from Wales. And I actually could keep going on. Yeah, you just seem to have a thing for Welsh people. I didn't try to plan it like that. But I just feel blessed that I've had the acceptance by people of that stature to want to work with me and on my work.
That opening monologue, with just sort of his voice radiating through the darkness, it really does set the tone for the whole of the musical. But I believe it wasn't always like that. Was there originally music beneath that opening monologue? Yeah,
yes, there was. And it was only after the recording in California, coming back and assembling it, where the sort of the light bulb lit over my head by thinking, why do I have this music? I quite like the music that I've written for it, but it's one of these less is more moments where if I take the music out, I'm just going to have Richard's voice and H.G. Wells's words, adapted by Doreen, but basically the opening of the book, all on its own. I don't need anything more than that. I'll wait to hit with the opening music after he says that opening speech. And it worked a charm. I chucked my music out.
And it really does sort of have that contrast when you hit those first, the dun dun dun, when you hear that. It sort of cuts through it straight away.
Thank you.
No one would have believed in the last years of the 19th century that human affairs were being watched from the timeless worlds of space. No one could have dreamed we were being scrutinized as someone with a microscope studies creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. Few men even considered the possibility of life on other planets. And yet, across the gulf of space, minds immeasurably superior to ours regarded this earth with envious eyes, and slowly and surely they drew their plans against us.
I just wanted to ask, this is something I read online. So the sounds that we hear sort of interspersed throughout the musical, I've heard that the technical term is a Wii-U. Is that correct?
No, it's called a Wii U because I didn't have any idea what else to call it. Yeah, it's a keyboard sound that I wanted it to sound in the story after the Martians land on Horsell Common for the first time, the first of about 10 cylinders in the story, and they're trying to communicate back to the cylinders that are following for Mars, essentially to say all is good. And the little melody that I wrote, I have to sing it as a Wii U.
Yeah, that's how I do it.
And it sounded like a Wii U to me. So if you were to see my original scores, it doesn't say piano or violin or guitar. It says
Is it
Wii
written
U.
in as a Wii U?
Yeah.
That's brilliant. That's really good. So this was the War of the Worlds was apparently the first large-scale production recorded on 48 tracks. How was it using this new technology? Did it make it easier to layer all of your different parts into one?
It was both that, and it was also a real challenge. And,
right.
And you're right. Certainly here in the UK, and I believe not just Europe, but possibly in the world, but certainly over here in Europe, 48-track production was unique, and it just happened. Again, coming back to just dumb luck. Advision, where I was recording almost all of the War of the Worlds, had a company next door to it that was an instrument and equipment hire company.
Right.
And they had literally just taken delivery of a little box, so to speak, called a maglink. And what it was doing was giving the ability for two machines to talk to each other, to link them up. I mean, today,
right.
with code and all the advancements in technology, the maglink was as crude as you could get, but it did eventually, it kept breaking down through every day virtually. We'd build in waiting time, so to speak, for the crew from the downstairs where all the repairs were being done, and they were waiting for me to call them, saying, okay, it's broken down again. But basically, it wasn't about two 24-track machines. It was almost any machine that you wanted to link with another of the same sort. So we were already on 24-track, and the general manager of the studio was keeping his ears into how we were doing, and came in to see me very early on in the production, because we started it as a 24-track production. That's all that.
Right.
That was the maximum that any recording could be in the tape world. And he said, we just taken delivery of this unit, this box called a maglink, and told me all about it. He says, would you like to give it a go? Because you could record 48 tracks, mix in 48 tracks. But it also had the ability to build up what were called slave tapes. So it wasn't just 48 tracks and that's your lot. You could have any amount of slave tapes, all with 24 tracks of sound on them, other than each tape had to have like a code being generated, so that the code of one tape was essentially shaking hands with the other. But all during the process of the recording, as we would finish filling up one of the two 24-track tapes, one had to remain the master. We would then sort of, when we got closer to the mixing time, we would sort of pre-mix things that had to be pre-mixed. So like if there was a track where there were a lot of vocals, I would possibly have to go from maybe 24 tracks of vocals and have no more than 4 to 6 of all the vocals. on that tape, and that's how it all progressed. So by the time we came to mixing, we were mixing 48 tracks.
Yeah. So I'm guessing that when you did the Next Generation in 2011, I'm guessing you didn't use the same 48 track. I'm guessing it was all digital.
Yeah, absolutely. But by the time we came to do it, I still had the final work of the War of the Worlds. It was on 75 or 76 multi-track tapes, and we sent it away first to be baked so that it wouldn't crackle in your hand and fall apart and just be looking at a zillion pieces on the floor of this tape. It was baked and then transferred from tape into digital, and one of the main engineers who worked with me here in my studio here for about 22 years, he spent about 3 months building up all the multi-track tapes from analog, putting them into digital, but in an organized way, so that when we came to do the new generation recording, it was a logical setup, because we were adding new sounds and new artists and everything about that. But but it was a totally digital recording.
So just on the Next Generation, did you reach out to Gary Barlow and Ricky Wilson, and how did you pick those two?
Well, you know, whenever I've been asked about how did you pick, and you name somebody who's just highly regarded in their field, I think, well, hold on. I'm not picking. I'm not going to you and say, you lucky chap or you lucky lady, you are now assigned to play this. There's nothing like that. I just always feel fortunate when I've been able to attract somebody to work with me particularly on these sort of projects. I had just been fortunate to get Jason Donovan to agree to tour with us in the War of the Worlds, one of our earlier arena tours, and we got on really well. He's such an easy guy to work with and to befriend. And we were sitting around, I think, after doing a session or just talking about the project, the touring. He said, you know, a friend of mine is a fan of the War of the Worlds. I said, oh, gosh, that's really nice to hear. He said, yeah, he's in a band, and, you know, you might be interested in meeting him. I said, oh, he's in a band, right. Would it be a band I know? And he said, well, maybe. They're called Take That. So at that point, I did take that. But my goodness, wow, like being smacked around the head. and it was Gary, and he had asked Jason if I would sign a double CD of the original double album.
He wanted an autograph from you.
Yeah, and I'm thinking as I'm signing it, what's going on here? I'm writing an autograph for Gary Barlow. That was the bottom line of it. And eventually, I was given Gary's email address and introduced myself. And I said, look, I understand you know the War of the Worlds, and I'm doing a new generation recording, and it's the part that Justin Hayward originally did on the original. It's the sung thoughts of the journalist, which meant, in terms of the name of the character, whether it's the touring or it's the double albums, when the journalist goes into more of a personal thought, it turns into a singing role. And when it's on tour, it's a physical part that role becomes. And Gary took 10 minutes maybe to respond. We were having lunch a few days later, and he was on board just as quick as that. And it was like with Richard, I thought this is going to take, you know, two main songs, harmonies, counterlines, whatever it was going to take. So I allocated, I think it was about 5 or 6 days. And I'll never forget that we had all this, as we always do with everybody, just even in the studio. But we always have, you know, some snacks and drinks and things that we ask if somebody likes anything particular to eat or to drink. And so there it is in the little kitchen in my studio, stacked high, all the stuff that we think he's going to enjoy. We will eat some of and drink. And he comes in with like a little box of pre-made food.
I had a packed lunch.
We were done in about 2 days or less. I don't even think we finished the second day. And again, I couldn't believe it. He's so good. He's so professional. And I guess because he's done so much live work over his career that he just knows how to get on with it. We got on real easily.
So that's something that I wanted to ask, actually, because I remember listening to The War of the Worlds as a kid, and it obviously says on the front, the musical version of The War of the Worlds. And so I used to think, there must be a musical of this touring around the West End or Broadway, or there must be a film of the musical, but nothing until, I think it was 2006 you guys first went on tour?
Yeah, that's right.
Why did you wait 30 years to take the musical and put it as a musical?
That's a good question. I was being asked to conduct concert renditions of what turned into this mega big multimedia extravaganza. It had been re-promoted in 2005 and was top of the charts again. We had club hits and another single succeeded. It just happened to all come along at a time when our promoters, who we've been with now for some 15 years, they were a different name at the time called Clear Channel. Today they're Live Nation. They asked me if I might want to conduct a concert rendition at the Royal Albert Hall. And right. I had actually been working for a couple of years designing with a team of people a much bigger rendition, bigger production than a concert rendition. But while I had been a guest conductor with like the London Symphony Orchestra and choir and other lineups of musicians, where I'd essentially basically do what became two big hits from the War of the Worlds, Forever Autumn and The Eve of the War. But here I was being asked to conduct the complete work. So right. I'd love to do it. I said, but by the way, I have in my studio big models and all sorts of things that would help give you an idea of what I've been working on for a couple of years, and it's about ready for me to start introducing myself to guys like you as promoters and thinking about something more than a concert rendition. And they said, okay, well, we'd be very keen to see what you got. But at that point, the concert rendition was announced up for sale for tickets, and it was going to be at the Royal Albert Hall. So there I knew I was going to be conducting at least once at one of the great venues of the world. Yeah. And it went on sale, and I got a call a day or so later from the gentleman at Live Nation, who's been the main man at that company for the War of the Worlds. He said they just had a call from the box office of the Royal Albert Hall, and they said you could sell out 10 to 12 other shows by the demand that your one show has already sold out. I said, oh my goodness, that's incredible. Said, but to do that, they couldn't offer any more dates because the Royal Albert Hall was already fixed with other artists and shows going in. But they said, we remember you saying you've got something that you'd been working on that was much larger in scale than a straight concert rendition. And I said, yeah, still here in my studio. They said, well, if we think this could work, would you like to consider putting it on as an arena tour? And we could add another 6 or 7 shows to the Royal Albert Hall. There was no O2 at that point. Right. So I guess the biggest in London at that point was Wembley. And they came over and they saw it. They were really impressed. They said, well, that's quite unique what you've got in your mind. And I said, thank you, yeah. And they said, well, we'll put it on sale. And they put on sale another 6 shows. So we now had 7. And they sold out as quickly as the Royal Albert Hall did.
Right.
By the time we did the tour, we had completed, I think it was 17 shows around England and in Dublin. And that really is what kicked off our tours. And now we've played countries in Europe, Australia, New Zealand. I think, from what I've been told, the War of the Worlds has come back very often, and compared to almost any other artist or band, it's right up there now with the reoccurring tours that we've been doing.
You were going to be on a huge tour this year, but obviously coronavirus has sort of put a stop to that. Can you tell us a little bit about what audiences would have seen on that tour?
Well, it's not what they would have, it's what they will, because unless this virus keeps all live shows away, we'll be touring next March all across the UK and Holland, and there's some other European territories that, had the virus not come along, we would have, I'd already be able to say, in these other countries, and we're hoping those interests will return. I don't have a set plan, so what I'll do is, and I've already started it, in fact, I'll start thinking, what area of the show could I, when I say improve, it could just be, adding on something, or there's new sound gear that comes along that allows me to place the sound. Been fortunate to work with a sound engineer that is terrific in his field, and we're always talking, what can we do next? What can we do next? And specifically with Richard Burton until 2010, each of the tours, he was a 3-dimensional talking head. But then filmed holography came along, and Liam Neeson came on board as the journalist, and I expanded the script. And I went back to those original recordings I did with Richard when it was that much longer. And I thought, some of this is really good stuff, and I'd love to reinstall it back into, firstly, the New Generation double album, because I don't have a limitation of time, because we're in the world of digital, but because of the shows, I've been learning how audiences were reacting, and so there were some good opportunities to bring back some of the script. I wrote a new song from a certain point in time. We played a West End season. It was supposed to be 7 weeks, but it ran for 11 because it was doing really well, and I wrote a new song for that. So that was in many of the tours, but then I brought in, as a character, H.G. Wells himself.
Right.
Who's not a character as if within the storyline. He appeared in 3 places. One of that was at the start, when he's 33 years old, a year after the War of the Worlds was first released, and he was just getting a reputation for having written that story, along with other things that he had written. And then the next time he appears was 20 years later, and he's now a world-renowned author, and he's got a view of life as 20 years older. And then toward the very end of the show, he reappears. He's in a rocking chair, and he's months away from his own passing. And he's looking back, having survived through 2 world wars, and he's essentially recognizing that there's nothing left for him to say. He's soon to pass away, and he's handing the future over to you, the youth, and it's for you to change the world now, and to make bad turn into good, and sentiments like that. And it was an amazing success. I think it surprised everybody when we brought HG, and it was 1 tour so far, but I think he may reappear on the next tour. So it's a mixture of content, technologies. With Liam Neeson, unlike with Richard, I was working with a living actor. So when we filmed him, we could film him in full body, and he appears in a couple of scenes where he's interacting live on stage. One is with Ricky Wilson, who you mentioned to me, who came into this tour, and he plays the artilleryman. And there's a moment where the artilleryman has just survived the first wave of the Martians who have landed on Horsell Common, and they have weapons and machines that they start to build, and they're wiping out everybody who's in and around that vicinity. He has survived, and he barely makes it to a house that's lived in by the journalist. His name is George Herbert. Okay, now, H.G., his real name was Herbert George Wells, and I turned it around to George Herbert, G.H.
Very nice.
There's Liam, full body on stage in 3D, and the artilleryman's crawling in. He's battered and bruised, and he's offered a drink by the journalist, by George. And yes, please, thank you. And and the journalist hands him this glass of water, and it's one of those moments where the audience see, hold on, how did this glass get from this 3D screen into the hands of the artilleryman who's drinking the water? And it's a trick, but it's a darn good one. And it's one of those moments where people say, how do they do that?
So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the 1992 musical version of Spartacus that you produced. So where did this idea come from? Did you have a sort of plan to keep going with different musical versions of stories that you really were invested in?
It was certainly one of those that I talked about with my dad before the War of the Worlds.
Right.
It was a book that I had read. It's a true story, but there was a very popular book that was turned into a movie with Kirk Douglas playing Spartacus. And I wasn't wanting to do another science fiction work, and this was an original story that my stepmom, Doreen, my dad's wife, started on with us, and it was heading in exactly the same direction as the War of the Worlds. But very sadly, Doreen had suffered with breast cancer for a number of years, and just as she was starting to work on the script of Spartacus, she passed away. And
right.
So we wound up eventually with another writer, and Spartacus came out. This is where both Catherine Zeta-Jones and Anthony Hopkins came into my life, and Anthony played the role of Marcus Crassus, who was as I mentioned earlier, the Roman senator who was credited with defeating Spartacus. Catherine played the woman of Spartacus, and it was mostly a singing role, but she also played opposite Anthony as the other sort of part of the story. It was like more of a ping pong match, whereas in the War of the Worlds you had this one journalist who had survived this Martian invasion, and 6 years later he's recounting his story for the newspaper he's now writing for. The name that Catherine was given as the woman of Spartacus was Payleen, which was a name that seems to have existed in that era. And in the story, she's one of the few survivors from the Thracian and European peoples. There was Africans and Germans that built up the armies over time. So she was one of the last to survive, and she was therefore, it was a good character to give the story from the non-Roman point of view. So you had these two characters, Antony from the Roman side finishing the story off, and Catherine from the Spartacus side talking about their side of the story and her eventual last moments wandering around looking for his body to see if she could bury him properly, but his body was never found.
Right. So yeah, so quite a lot to fit into a musical, and I noticed that this time you moved away from the sort of disco, sort of funky sound, and went to more of a film score-ish sort of sound. Why was that move? Why?
Well, interesting. I've never thought of it like that, as like a film score sound, because there's some very heavy beats and things that had, you know, the grooves of the day changed between 76 and 78 when it came out to what was now the late 80s, and it came out in 1992. It was the nature of the story as well. I worked with an amazing vocal group called Ladysmith Black Mambazo. I don't know if you're familiar with, but they became, over a number of years, they broke through from appearing and not just recording, but touring with Paul Simon on an album called Graceland. And they were from the township of Ladysmith in South Africa. And I wrote these two songs with my lyricist, Gary Osborne, and they were in English, and Ladysmith then added Zulu chants opposite the songs that they were singing in English. Two of the most enjoyable recordings I've ever done. They were just magical to work with, and so what the music was ultimately for the listener was a combination of a type of groove that I wrote for the piece and arranged for it, and their chants, which had rhythms of their own set against the English. So always within the story there was a reason why the music evolved to what it became. Spartacus was the role of Spartacus because he was a powerful gladiator. His role on the singing side was much more powerful. I think you'd say it had a serious rock edge to it. And the whole idea was for me to, like the War of the Worlds, to thread it all together to sound like it was a natural, continuous work. The War of the Worlds, like Spartacus, has no cuts on it. You don't come to the end of a cut and there's a bit of a gap and then another song. It's a continuous work. But you're certainly right that it's a different sound than the War of the Worlds. And I'm hoping actually to return to it and explore it for live performance, because it's actually a real natural to perform live. I want to, like I've done with the War of the Worlds, I want to add a couple of new pieces and just go back to work on it before we'd return to it properly in a way that we're performing it. But it's an interesting observation you made. I never actually thought about it as being more filmic.
It's so interesting that you did. We had a musical version of War of the Worlds and a musical version of Spartacus. Were there any other contenders that you just never got round to turning into a fully fledged musical? I'm really interested to know what the other books were that you could have made.
Well, yeah, I can tell you a couple of them. There's an American author named Jack London, who actually lived and had some of his most popular books published virtually at the same time as H.G. Wells with some of his. And Jack London used to write, or certainly two of his most popular books, called The Call of the Wild and White Fang, were set in the Alaskan wilderness during the gold rush time, and they were great adventures, great battles, instead of the War of the Worlds, which is alien versus human. This was, and Spartacus was man against man, master over slave. This would have been more about humans and the animals of the wild. And I actually started composing a piece, and this was about the time that my arena tours began. And that's actually been perhaps the main reason why I haven't written and released a third musical work, which has been my, an ambition. I hope that will happen. Because the tours have grown into, say, a West End run that you mentioned earlier about the audio book with Michael Sheen, which also had another Welshman. I just remembered, Taron Egerton, who played the artilleryman. And that's a big project, a 5-hour project. And recording it again, expanding it, and it had its own flow. So there's been other things that I've done that have just marked chunks of my time. And to do something properly, I've never been somebody who likes to have a lot of different things going at the same time. I don't think I could. That's just my nature. From the moment that my dad rejected my resignation to write a West End musical with him, more out of fear and insisting that I did write the music, I've never stopped.
Fantastic. Okay, well, that's about it from me, Jeff. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this interview today. I really, really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Reece. It's been a pleasure, very enjoyable, and can't wait to see what you do when you put it all together.
Hey guys, thank you so much for listening to this, the part 2 of the Jeff Wayne War of the Worlds special. Thank you so much to everyone at Jeff Wayne's recording studio, especially Lizzie, Troup, who helped make this possible. And make sure you follow us on social media, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and make sure you give us a good rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from, and we will see you in the future. Goodbye.